Good evening and welcome to This Week in Northern California. I'm Belva Davis. And joining me tonight on our news panel are Tom Vacar, consumer editor for KTVU News, and Paul Rogers, environment writer with the San Jose Mercury News, and Aimee Allison, publisher for OaklandScene.com. And Aimee, we'll start with you because a few weeks back on this program you said if the ground game was what it was supposed to be, Oakland would be in for a surprise in terms of Jean Quan's fortunes. So what was the game?
Well, you know, ranked choice voting was the first time that Oakland voters actually used ranked choice voters to pick mayor. Alameda County finally implemented it, and it really did change the political game. I said the ground game was going to be the determining factor because Jean Quan ultimately, as a candidate, emphasized actually going door to door. And when she went door to door, she and her volunteers, they not only asked for first choice, rank, but second and third. They weren't shy about that. The same went for Rebecca Kaplan. Don Parada, in contrast, campaigned very differently. His campaign was dominated by mailers that cost a lot of money, instead of this kind of ground game that asked for, hey, if I don't get your first rank vote, give me second or third. So it was really, the surprise was not that surprising when you look at the fact that ranked choice voting changes the game. It changes it less from a core base because Don Parada got the most first choice votes, but he didn't have a broad-based coalition. And the fact of the matter is Jean Quan and her ground game really did make that coalition strong. We
want to be sure that people understand when you say first, second, and third, you don't mean for the same person. You mean for a first person, a second person, and a third person?
Right. Isn't that interesting? Ranked choice voting is a relatively new form of voting for America, particularly in cities. And so a lot of counties don't use that, cities and counties across the country. Alameda County is one of the early adopters. So the results of the election that have people confused is the initial reports that Don Parada, when they first calculated the votes, got a majority, 34% of the first rank. But in the ranked choice voting, everyone can rank up to 3 candidates out of the 10 that ran, but everyone gets 1 vote. Ultimately, you get 1 vote. And the way that it works, simply stated, is you vote for your first, those are calculated, and then through a series of eliminations, if your candidate, your first choice candidate is eliminated, then your second choice vote then goes to the remaining candidates, and on and on. And what we saw is in the last rounds, when it was just Don Parada, Jean Quan, and Rebecca Kaplan, that because Rebecca Kaplan had encouraged her supporters to rank Jean Quan as second or third, 18,000 votes, 3/4 of the votes, went to Jean Quan, pushing her over the top.
The question, though, I would have is, if there would have been a traditional runoff, if they had not done this, I'm pretty certain that Don Parada would have probably won the second in the runoff.
You know why I agree with you? Because traditional runoffs require raising a lot of money. And Don Parada had deep pockets and supporters with a lot of money, and he was running a very expensive campaign. I think by the end of the campaign, with just 2 weeks remaining, he had raised and spent $669,000, totally dwarfing the other candidates. If this had been a traditional runoff, yes, money would have worked. But in this case, the political game was changed because money, just putting more money into the campaign doesn't guarantee a victory with ranked choice. So there was a reason that Don Parada...
It doesn't guarantee a victory with any choice. That Meg Whitman would be governor if the most money won the gubernatorial race. I think the thing that a lot of people who don't live in Alameda are confused about is that one person was the first choice of 40,000 voters, another person was the first choice of 29,000 voters, and the person who was first choice of 40,000 voters lost the election.
To say that the first choice lost the election is a misnomer, though.
But Don
Parada had the most first ranked choice, but he didn't have the most votes. And in ranked choice voting, it's still one person, one vote. And ultimately, even if you, in this type of election, even if you win by 1 vote, you still win. So the distribution is different. but ultimately he didn't win the most number of votes. And that's really there's a lot of confusion about that.
I think confusion is the word of the day. And maybe political scientists will be studying this race all over the country for years to come. But do we know whether there was confusion, particularly with older voters or first-time voters, maybe immigrants?
I heard that from particularly Don Parada's campaign, who raised that in the days between the final, waiting for the final vote. Fairvote.org, which is an organization that are experts in ranked choice voting, showed that over 70% of people ranked 3, and that 99% of the ballots were valid. So
we've done Jean Quan a disservice. We have not talked about what she plans to do for the city. She is the winner. She has a deep background in Oakland politics. Tell us in the last few minutes something about Jean Quan.
Well, she's got her hands full. Oakland's facing a very large deficit. Recently, 80 police officers were laid off. Those need to be reinstated. Public safety is very important, as are job creation and the economy, the local economy. So she's already indicated that Henry Gardner, who's a former city manager, will come in and step in to help her with the transition team and get her hands really into addressing those issues very soon off, hit the ground running. And I cannot stop by saying, but she's historically significant. The first woman mayor in 158 years of the city's history, the first Asian American woman mayor of a major city. And so Oakland has to have a nod to her historical significance as well.
So a surprise ending to that story, and we turn now to you, Paul, for another surprise ending. I mean, when you were here last, I think the last thing you thought about in terms of Proposition 21 is that it would be defeated.
Absolutely. Well, I thought actually Prop 21 was going to be one of the closest things on the ballot. California is a Democratic state. There are 2.5 million more registered Democrats in California than Republicans. Basically, that amounts to a 13-point lead. Any Republican who runs in California starts 13 points behind. And the one thing about state parks, which Prop 21 would have helped fund with an $18 annual fee on people's vehicle licenses, is that it's one of the last things in California that isn't particularly political. A lot of conservatives like state parks because they represent California's heritage and history and sort of common thread and culture. A lot of liberals like state parks because of the wildlife benefits, because of the open space, the watershed values. And I think it really stunned a lot of political watchers that this lost so badly. I mean, this wasn't even close. It lost 58 to 42, and the environmental groups like the Nature Conservancy, Audubon Society, Save the Redwoods League, who funded this, spent 100 times more money than the no side. They spent $7 million to $74,000, and it's very clear that voters in this election, liberal and conservative, were not in any mood to spend any more money on anything. And I suppose in hindsight, when you look at the 12.6% unemployment, the worst economy since the Great Depression, that makes sense. And finally, when you look at Sacramento politicians' approval ratings right now, they're in the 20% range. And so even though the text of this measure said that the money couldn't be spent on anything but parks, I don't think people believe that.
And the question is, now what's next? Voters weren't in the mood to approve more money for parks, but are they in the mood to see shuttered parks?
It might not matter what they're in the mood for. They're going to get shuttered parks. Last year, Governor Schwarzenegger tried to close 220 of the 278 state parks. And these aren't just obscure little parks. I mean, on the hit list was Angel Island, Mount Diablo, Año Nuevo, Henry Coe State Park, major pieces of California's natural heritage and history. And when the public rose up and opposed that, instead the State Parks Department said, all right, we'll have reduced hours at 150 during the winter. Well, guess what? This week the winter season started. I was driving on Wednesday up Highway 1 in San Mateo County, and there were several state beaches that were padlocked. So it's already begun. And, with the $25 billion deficit that we just learned about this week for the state that Jerry Brown's going to be facing, I can't imagine that any new money is going to state parks from state government. There are going to be more cuts and potentially more closures.
What I worry about is not even so much the shuttering as the wholesale ripping off of these parks, people going in there doing damage, taking things, a lot of metal in there that people might want for scrap. There's a lot of relics and artifacts and all kinds of things that are worth stealing. I hate to say that, but it's the truth. Is there any plan to deal with this so that we don't have a rape of the parks because they're just not being looked after.
We're already getting some of that. I mean, a lot of these parks, particularly ones near urban areas that are fairly large, like Henrico in Santa Clara County, they have been infiltrated, if you will, by armed Mexican marijuana gangs who have had a harder time smuggling pot across the border as the border security's gone up. And so they're growing marijuana in these parks. Hikers are running across it. These guys have guns. It's pretty dangerous because there's fewer and fewer rangers. So to your question, I mean, what they're going to do is if they have to close more of them next year, you know, they'll have one ranger maybe for 5 parks who makes a stop like once a day. But yeah, you're right. I mean, they're going to be harmed. So, you know, going forward, I think the question is, a lot of voters would say there are other priorities more important than state parks, you know, schools, public safety, things like that. And so what can be done to preserve this great system of the state's heritage? And there are a lot of ideas, you know, corporate sponsorship, a voluntary checkoff box. Maybe you put a voluntary box for people's DMV registration, and then after a while you move it and make it opt out, where you automatically get charged unless someone opts out, which is what they do in Washington State.
So not a bright future for parks.
No.
Fees are already up and going up, and will probably go up more.
Yeah, we're going to see higher entrance fees and less for it. I mean, I wish there was some good news this week on this, but there's not.
Okay, let's turn to some news, though. The news of giants, I'll call this. And that, of course, is because there is the battle over who can be more powerful, the Giants, the team that we just all reveled in their victory, or Larry Ellison, the father of the decision on whether San Francisco gets the America's Cup.
It's a heck of a thing when you have to start to say, let's let cooler heads prevail, because you got some very big egos that are involved in this. But let me go to another big ego, but a guy who I have a lot of respect for because he really understands that, and is Willie Brown. Mm-hmm. Willie Brown says that if we get the America's Cup, this is absolutely equivalent of getting not 1 but 3 Super Bowls. He says for the investment that you make, we should probably get $300 to $500 million a year for 3 years out of this thing. And the reason for that is that the America's Cup, unlike the Olympics or the World Cup soccer match and all that stuff, the America's Cup goes on for months and months and months. All kinds of preliminaries, all kinds of things going on. A lot of building has to be done to house these boats and the crews. The crews themselves are very large in number. They bring their families with them because they're there for so long. So a lot of people will move into the city. And then you have this specter of the city of San Francisco being shown all over the world for week after week, month after month, in various sporting channels and all kinds of things. So it's a tremendous opportunity for San Francisco, provided it is chosen. Now, the question is there a contender? To hear the America's Cup people talk about it, the contender is some port city in Italy. Valencia, Spain was recently told it is no longer in consideration. There are other people that say that the America's Cup people are simply saying there's another contender to get as many concessions out of San Francisco as they want, which would include a tremendous amount of real estate that would be taken over by them and refurbished by them, which would be a great benefit to the city. But then they would have access and control of this property for many years to come. And we're primarily talking about some of the piers south of the Bay Bridge, but these are very large piers that have very large commercial potential. Given the condition of the economy, anything that would help that development probably would be to the good.
So let me ask, the Giants and the America's Cup folks are fighting over the same land. They're fighting in alternate development projects. Who gets to call the shots?
Well, it's ultimately going to probably be up to the Board of Supervisors and the mayor, and certainly the governor is going to chime in on this, and there's going to be some federal issues that involve. I mean, this is going to be a very large decision. But basically, the Giants say, and with some credibility, look, we came down here when this was not a very nice place to be. We really have started, you know, a lot of the real rebirth of South of Market and all of that stuff, and that's all true. On the other hand, what Ellison brings to this is an enormous opportunity to do some development on a very large scale and very rapidly, because remember, this thing is going to happen very, very quickly in terms of 2 or 3 years down the road. So there are 2 very good arguments to be made. Now, if these 2 parties could get together and figure out how they're going to do this thing, the ultimate beneficiary would be the Bay Area.
The ringmaster in this, though, is another star, and that's the mayor of this city, who has been working on trying to make this a reality, bringing the America's Cup.
Yeah, and there are a lot of people that feel that this is good, and the Board of Supervisors overwhelmingly seem to be in favor of this. Now, there are some exceptions to that, Chris Daley being one, but Chris Daley will shortly be gone.
As will the mayor.
As will the mayor, but the reality is whoever the next mayor is going to be cannot possibly see this as not an opportunity to take care of some of these piers which are in terrible condition and need to be dealt with. So as a result, there's a lot of stuff going on. But what are we talking about? We're talking about probably 9,000 to 12,000 jobs that would be created by the America's Cup. We're talking about $1.4 to $1.9 billion and 2.6 million additional visitors coming to San Francisco on top of the bunch that we already have.
Are they asking for public money at all?
At this point, no, but they've got to be committed to help raise private money in the amount of $270 million, which is a lot of money. But if the city can help in ways that doesn't cost it money, then it is going to inure to the benefit of the city, because the multiplier effect of the money coming in, the tourism. Another person I talked to, and kind of like the end-all be-all of this, is Peter McLaughlin, is one of the executives of Qantas Airways. He's the Northern California director of Qantas Airways. When the little town called Perth, Australia, got the America's Cup, it transformed that city into a major league city. Now, San Francisco is already a major league city, but he says you cannot believe what it does for tourism. He says it's not just people coming to see the America's Cup, it is people coming to see San Francisco. And on top of that, if it's done in the Bay, you have this amphitheater where hundreds of thousands of people can watch. It could be a tremendous thing for San Francisco.
I can see where it's caught your imagination.
Yeah.
Well, my thanks to all of you for joining us here tonight.